What if a list of kings is a map of time that you cannot read? You stand in a room of stillness. Clay breathes in the dark. I will guide you through the pages of dust. Where are you now? And what time is it for you? A question opens the space. There is no hurry here. We will move slowly. We will follow marks on clay and the intervals between them. You may subscribe to stay with the patient, close reading of records. You may return when the quarry is quiet. Stay. Listen. There will be no sudden answers, only the slow unfolding of evidence in its own careful order. It begins not with a revelation or a coup, but with an assumption, layered and unexamined. The Sumerian King List, so often cited, recited, debated in hushed voices behind stone shelves, is accepted to be a creation of symbol, not chronology. The reign lengths recorded there, hundreds and thousands, then tens of thousands of years, are encountered as if they were myth's clever disguise. This is the sanctioned reading, that such numbers, elongated and improbable, are signals of something beyond the literal, a flourish of reverence, a literary reach, an ordered mythology pressed into the surface of clay. Not even the careful hands of later scribes, not even the patient recovery of the fragments, can fully unravel that settled comfort of disbelief. This is what you inherit, moving quietly among the dust and the absence, an assumption so often repeated, it becomes the slow pulse beneath the record. The fragments arrive not as shattered myth, but as persistent evidence, unyielding and repeated. They settle before you, the weld Blundell prism, turning gently beneath museum glass, its four facets bearing line upon line of wedge-cut script, the worn tablets from Nippur and Lhasa, each fragment a surviving witness to a vanished order. You draw near. The same long numbers receive you, inscribed with a practiced precision. Multiple copies, penned at different crossings of centuries and geography, reproduce the same figures, vast, undiminished. The notation is not hasty. Each number is rendered in sexagesimal, the base 60 of Sumer complex, deliberate, careful. These are not annotations, not marginalia scrawled as afterthoughts. The numbers occupy the formal line, their presence equal to the names they accompany. Each ruler receives their years, untrimmed by skepticism, entered with a solemnity which time itself cannot easily dissolve. Upon the weld Blundell prism, the numbers thread their way alongside cities, names, and silences, recorded with neither qualification nor apology. Where the fragmentary tablets falter, uncertain at the edge of the break, what remains is always the same logic. It is a pattern, unbroken even through the discontinuity of centuries. You trace the columns, whether whole or broken, and everywhere the same earth-dark signs, ordered in rows, numbers multiplied and repeated, a ledger with no footnote. Each line is a line of deliberate convergence. What was written was meant to be preserved. There is a care here, the slow respect of the record. The scribes do not seem to doubt their own method. Across copies, the same units and multipliers, sars, ners, recur, a rhythm built into the tabulation. Worn stylus impressed into soft clay, baked, perhaps, then broken, then gathered. It is insistence. The pattern becomes clearer the longer you look. It is a pattern of survival, less a story than an account. The numbers drift forward down the list, like echoes along the hallway of absence. You encounter them recurring, measure by measure, through each surviving fragment. A ledger, yes, but not of coin or grain. Something else is tallied. Even if the meaning sits far back in the cave of the past, beyond the reach of illumination, this is what resists dismissal. The numbers remain, copied with a kind of fidelity rare in such ancient documents. The compilers, over generations, preserve the same extravagant totals, make the same careful choices, do not flinch from repeating what seems impossible. The names fade, the cities crumble. The tablets themselves fracture, but the columns of numbers do not shrink or simplify. You stand before them, not with resolution, but with an accumulation of evidence you cannot quite set aside. The numbers persist, occupying not just the tablet, but the record-keeping gesture itself, a pattern left intact by the passage of all that followed. Yet the assumption remains, persistent as dust. Symbolism, not measurement, a language of excess, not duration. But you look again. The numbers are not marginal, not set aside as commentary or decorative excess. They are accorded the same dignity, the same authority, as the names of cities, as the identities of rulers. It is a peculiar fidelity, a strange consistency that holds across centuries, lands, and hands. There is a quiet where the list ends. You return again and again, letting the surface quiet settle, letting the pattern work its way inward. The numbers are not erased. They are not corrected. They remain where they were first put down, like the fossil impressions of things no longer visible but not yet fully lost. There is no certainty here, no satisfied explanation or closure, only the fidelity of record, the persistence of the sum, the careful work of generations of scribes. Ledgers of forgetting, columns of survivors, the slow arithmetic of memory. What if these sums were not years, but something else? The list endures. Every reading of it begins in quiet confidence. These numbers, these names, this succession, a sequence of years that will yield, as years do, to counting. The present eye is drawn to the columns erased by time, but reconstructed by habit, each numeral an anchor to the common sense of chronology. It is, at first, almost soothing. Across the centuries, the same numbers recur as if unbroken by loss or decay, stretching themselves over the brittle textures of clay, repeating their promise. Each sign settles onto the tablet, suggesting certainty. This reign was 60 years, that one 120. The mind follows the sequence, finding order where the script grants it. To count is to know, or so it seems. Yet beneath the patina of order, silence gathers. The list's smooth arithmetic offers little resistance, but other tablets disrupt the calm. The annals of administration, of tribute paid and seed counted, remind you that counting is no single act. There are the tables portable, ephemeral, marked by hand, pressed by reed. Here, a numeral is not just an age or a reign, but a cipher waiting for context. Years are one register, but there is the Sa, the Ner, the Gesh, multiples of 60, of 10, of 600, hierarchies of units embedded in the script, slanting every total into ambiguity. The raw surface of administration records of fields, of rations, of labour makes clear that counting follows not one path but many. The same sign, the same wedge, mutated in practice by unstated scales, by the conventions of the day. Training tablets, incised with identical numerals in varying scales. Scribal hands replicate the forms, not for chronology, but for facility and flexibility. 60 as 1, 1 as 60, a sign rehearsed in different registers until it drifts, dislocated, from any anchor in fixed quantity. The business of the city moves with these numbers, not as statements, but as instruments. Markers for grain, cattle, wages, each obeying a logic only partially recoverable from the layers of dust. Within the list proper, multiplicity persists. Some numerals fade beneath a fragment's edge. Others appear retraced, overwritten by later hands, corrections faintly pressing through old mistakes. There are sections where parentheses cradle a value, or where a sign receives a gloss, a multiplicative mark. Compilers, then as now, hesitate before the ragged edge of the record. One copy gives a king years beyond reckoning, another reduces the span, as if reconciling an error too subtle to reconstruct. A different city's copy bestows a similar name with a new regime of numerals. Disagreement is preserved as fact, not out of confusion or malice, but as the condition of the archive. Clarity is sought and repeatedly deferred, replaced by an oscillation. The script remains, yet its grammar does not wholly survive. In the archive's hush, the apparatus of numbering is perfectly present, and yet, in every instance, uncertain. The forms survive in stone and clay, in the brittle rules of bureaucratic practice, in the repetitive habits of trained scribes. Yet what is meant, what it is that the list tallies drifts each time the surface is read. Each digit may be a reign, a dynastic memory, a mnemonic device, or simply a repetition of what was always done. The unity of measure slips beyond recovery. The urge to assign a year to each sign, a meaning to each total, remains persistent, comforting, almost inescapable. Silence stretches between incompatible readings, in the space where a number should clarify but instead distorts. Gaps in the clay absorb intent, turn precision to ritual. Even the most technical of tables, the most lexically precise of lists, do not resolve the core hesitation. The seduction of counting, of believing that each entry refers to a familiar span of time, is a temptation reassuring and insistent. Yet every table, every gloss, every repaired numeral quietly testifies to a grammar unshared and a reckoning lost to memory. Beneath the weight of its own ambiguity, the numbers are all that remain, yet their meaning thins with every effort to fix it. In the quiet beyond the record, in the indeterminacy that nestles in the ruins and shadows, only the question lingers. What do we do with a count whose grammar we no longer share? There is a story, told and retold, of the King List. The listing of reigns, names, durations, inscribed carefully to endure. It is said to be one thing, unbroken, seamless, a single composition, a vessel carrying orderly time through the corridors of clay and memory. This is the expectation that hangs, unresolved, over the tablets. The text as unitary, committed once and for all, transmitted intact, the voice of authority echoing forward from its point of origin into every copy and recitation that followed. It has long been easier, and perhaps gentler, to accept that the King List remains as it began. But there is the surface, and there is what sits beneath. When you return to the clay and the pressed impressions, another story traces itself, patient and inarticulate, waiting for the angle of light, the slowed gaze, the moment between reading and recognition. Here, assumptions dissolve not in a moment, but gradually, under the pressure of close attention. There, on the tablet, you find not a uniform inscription but the ghost layering of process, the aftermath of touch and revision. The evidence lies unclaimed on the skin of the object. Under raking light, the established text falls away. Lines once thought final begin to shift, to tremble on their seams. There are erasures, shallow at first, mere disturbances on the surface where a stylus passed and repassed. Some cuts defy the eye, except when shadows lengthen erased signs, half lifted, half buried, now only the slightest differential in the dust-bound clay. Over these, darker incisions solidify a different choice, a correction snared forever in the medium's reluctance to forget. Here and there, a character is retraced, the path of the instrument doubling back, at once correcting and highlighting the original hesitation. Each sign declares not only its meaning, but its own making and remaking, layered atop what lies just beneath. Orthography, too, betrays its mutability. Within a single column, a sign form emerges, repeats, then is corrected, replaced with another, as if the hand had paused and deliberated in the act of copying. What persists are not the proud variants of poetry, not playful invention, but the record of intervention, the discrete, anonymous moments when a sign became something else because it had to, or because another hand unseen, unremembered, intervened. The work of the scribe is folded into the work of the previous scribe, each presence negated and yet inscribed, each correction nestling into the uncertainty left behind by its own necessity. Examined closely, joints and seams emerge, the tangible scars of reshaping. Where a groove crosses awkwardly, where the alignment is minutely skewed, it marks not the perfection of a masterwork, but the evidence that this tablet is not what it first claimed to be. Perhaps a line was trimmed away, or the tablet was pressed anew, refashioned to fit another context. That original moment now half remembered in the fissure that runs beneath the text. preservation is not the absence of change. The attempt to record leaves its own trail of loss and repair, a palimpsest of intentions, layered without overt design. To look carefully is to read the tablet's memory, not only what it has chosen to say, but also what it carries forward unwillingly. The concrete text, once presumed singular, recedes before accumulation. Hands correcting hands, lines overwriting lines, pockets of silence vented by deliberate erasure and awkward revision. When tracked from beginning to end, a passage may begin in one style and emerge in another. The scribes' resolve mapped in the shifting signature of their forms. Even where all appears unbroken, the clay's surface betrays its reticence. The record giving up the half-obliterated residue of something that was there and then not, an absence preserved through effort as much as presence. Instead, a communal labour is recorded as a residue, distributed and invisible, a choreography of effort, memory, and doubt. Each correction is a brief window into loss, an unspoken uncertainty, a hand laid over another hand, then another, then silence. The text must contain every stage of its own undoing, every repair, and every attempted forgetting. We do not find a singular origin, but a place of convergence, a surface written over, pared back, laced with seams and tangles impossible to fully resolve. But an archive of interventions, a quiet ledger of absence and reappearance. The King List becomes less a monument and more a surface on which imperfection is both marked and preserved, an archive of those who scraped, retraced, hesitated. In the measureless intervals between intention and correction, between assertion and erasure, the record unfolds as an open question, not an answer. In the low hush of the storage room, or the twilight of an excavation trench, the sense persists. We stand before not a document, but a layered field of memory and forgetting. It is neither wholly silent nor entirely decipherable. To attend to it is to register the slow circling of hands that laboured to name and to restore, to record and to remake, always relinquishing what once seemed fixed. What does a text tell us when its surface preserves the edits of many readers? The story, repeated softly in the background of scholarship and in the margins of chronicles, holds. The order of cities, inscribed, preserved, recited, unfolds as an unbroken ribbon, each city's primacy surrendering directly and cleanly to the next. The list, that curiously enduring string of names, insists without apology. Eridu follows Kish. Kish leads to Uruk. The legacy, the succession, appears orderly, as if each city were quietly waiting for its reign, collecting the scepter at the very moment its predecessor loosened its grip. We are told, through this sequence, of a world in which the passage of preeminence is seamless, each city briefly sovereign, threading together a millennium with no visible seam. The ground, however, stores other memories. The spadework at Eridu, at Kish, at Uruk, unwraps slow, dense layers. Loam compressed by centuries, burnt brick answering sun after centuries of darkness, platforms upon platforms, temple over hollowed temple, the weight of earth thickening the mystery rather than thinning it. Archaeological trenches become silent witness. Here, beneath the surface, the expected sequence is less certain, the clarity of the list dissolving in the mineral hush of strata. Stones lie in patient succession, but not always in the order demanded by syllables on clay. At Eridu, the blade of an archaeologist's trowel reveals the edge of a platform and old altar, one phase of worship pressed in beneath another, with the dust of abandonment in between. At Kish, a laboratory sifts the residue of occupation from a band of compacted clay, the imprint of temporary life layered by the later hand of time. Nothing is unbroken. The evidence presents itself between the cracks. Habitation horizons, those subtle compressions where the presence of feet, fires, hands made their mark, yield to radiocarbon. The samples return not continuous centuries, not an unyielding rain, but a spread, a range, a field of maybe. Sometimes the same layer belonging to 2 decades at once, sometimes silence. What is found is not one city's clear fall and another's sudden rise, but palimpsest, a city extinguished before another is ready to inherit. Gaps appear, Eridu's ceremonial heart layered over earlier, more fragmentary residues, but nowhere is a torch passed hand to hand. Instead, there are tremors of abandonment, ashy voids, intervals of decay, floors eroded by absence. In Uruk, the tumbled pottery and fill layers is jumbled, a vessel wedged awkwardly in collapse, pressed in the same soil where, decades or centuries later, new walls would rise. Material evidence resists the neat choreography. Transfer is not immediate, succession is not seamless. The list, in its simplicity, names a city. Then, after it, another. The roll call intones with measured inevitability, yet the earth tells a rhythm of its own, one that staggers, hesitates, breaks. The chain is only a shape imposed on restless matter. The dirt and stone, the weathered fragments, are silent where the list is smooth. Ash, the silent consequence of what came and went, lies between the bricks, unclaimed by any name, carrying nothing forward but the echo of occupation, paused, ended, or never returned. The interval between the trace of one population and the appearance of the next is preserved not in words, but in the voids left behind, the compacted silt with no sign of purposeful use. Uncertain as the flickering of a candle's edge, resist the tyranny of uninterrupted succession. They do not present rulership, only intervals. These samples, measured against a scale both ancient and imprecise, tell of time as a field, a cloud, not as a wire pulled tight between beginning and end. A habitation horizon is defined by what can be found, but what can be found is often haunted by what is missing. The list cannot account for these silences, these accidents of erosion or deliberate destruction. The city named is rarely the only city breathing in its century, and the passing between them is more hesitation than handover. Each trench, each shard, each empty floor resonates with what cannot be fully known. The evidence remains, a residue, imprinted but indistinct. Witnesses are not present, only their traces linger, and sometimes not even those. The list, stable and linear, is deaf to the hesitations of the ground. The succession in record is not the succession in ruin. Clay tablets connect what the soil allows to be separated. The memory, too, is layered. A city remembered before it is ready to be named as lost. A city founded before it is ready to inherit its predecessor's crown. Between, there is only the hush pressed beneath the surface, the memory of dust, the memory of absence, the silent argument of earth against narrative. How should we frame a list that moves without pausing where the earth pauses? The assumption persists, quietly, at the heart of the fieldwork and the archive, holding together fragments and surfaces with a slender thread of certainty, that the year-name tablets, scattered across administrative houses and entombed within ruined temples, provide a parallel and independent apparatus for reckoning time. In this view, unfolding with the gentle authority of tradition, every inscribed clay tablet is a silent partner to the King List, each one anchoring regnal lengths, not by proclamation, but by the slow accretion of days and rations, contracts and obligations. A tablet is dated. A transaction has its place. There is a sense, almost a comfort, in the regularity of the formula, the reliability of its sequence. The calendar, it seems, reveals the pulse of the absent city, each year an answer to the problem of rule. Yet, as each site gives way to dust, and the cataloger's hands trace the edges of the archive, the record begins to flicker. What is preserved is only what survived, and survival is always partial. The administrative archives, long stripped of context, now whisper in the language of inventory and seal. Each year name stands tied to the name of a ruler, to a stone or a sealed jar, to a record of barley, copper, or oil. The evidence waits, patient as dust, in houses collapsed under layers of abandonment, in temple storerooms half buried by the slow breath of centuries. The sequences of year names unwind themselves in modest, measured intervals. They do not sing of uninterrupted reigns. They pause, restart, fracture, diverge. Those who inscribed their tablets into the damp clay did not anticipate the gaps that would remain. They only wrote for a present account, a ledger to close, a contract witnessed and stored. Node by node, the excavated registers tell of activity quickened and then stilled, a ration dispersed, a contract sealed, a shipment recorded. Each arc is brief, localized, and tightly bound to the event at hand. The passage of time emerges not as a single, unbroken current, but as a series of short channels, each bounded by silence. When the record stops, the silence is not the silence of endurance, but the silence of nothing more to say. The absence weighs as heavily as the impression of a stylus. The sequence is not endless. It does not imply extension. It becomes, instead, a limit, a horizon marked by what remains for us to read. The register is resolutely local, bounded by the circumstances of its creation and the accidents of its survival. Where the sequence thickens, activity was present. Where it breaks, the sequence does not imply invisible centuries, but only an edge, a closing of account, a missing contract, the moment when writing ceased. Across sites, one can observe the peculiarities that resist amalgamation. Year-name lists in one temple diverge from those in a neighbour's storehouse. Some bear epithets unknown elsewhere. Others repeat, stutter, or lapse into silence. The names are not always royal. Attested events are discreet, and their order can subtly contradict the sequence implied by a distant king's court. Royal attributions fracture once, compared across the geography of recovery. It is in the cross-reading of these fragments that the edges of certainty dissolve. To trace a year name is to follow only the path that was both written and preserved. To date, a tablet is to acknowledge what is missing with the same weight as what is present. The written document, the administrative tablet, becomes not simply a record, but a witness to interruption. It records what could be measured and is silent where there is nothing left to say. The formulas on these tablets, repeated and formal, are unwavering in their economy. A transaction formula, a seal, an attribution of economic act to a named year. Administrators, perhaps indifferent to questions of posterity, recorded their details for the needs of their own present, not for the questions we now ask in the dust of the archive. The local precision of the administrative record stands in a kind of tension with the telescoping sweep of lists that stretch reins into the horizon. When the tablet ends, it is not stretched to fill the silence with years. The record ceases. A ledger, after all, needs closure. What is recorded, what is missing, are equally part of the evidence. The written traces measure their own boundaries, their own limits, reflecting a rhythm of activity punctuated by intervals of rest, abandonment, or oblivion. Year-name sequences, so often invoked as confirmation, instead begin to trouble the very ground beneath the duration of monarchy. In the absence of further writing, uncertainty takes on the shape of the broken tablet, the gap in the sequence, the ledger that closes without ceremony. Evidence does not speak beyond its own bounds. Time itself is registered only where there is writing, and the absence is not a guarantee of long rule or lost years. It is only what remains when the pen is set aside. The question lingers in the afterlight of the archive. There is a quiet confidence that attends the lines of the King List, an accepted belief that what has been catalogued is complete, authored with a finality that leaves little room for uncertainty. The sequence as inscribed stands as if it were the whole, a continuum without fracture. Each ruler named in succession as though history were a polished corridor of unbroken memory. In this view, nothing essential is missing. The stones speak, the lists endure. Yet below and between these incised names, there is a gentler hum, the insinuation of what is not shown, not spoken, not inscribed here. One begins, at first, with trust. The King List is comprehensive. It selects, it preserves, it recalls. Its limits seem to be those of the world it catalogues. But time is not always so easily confined. Layers of dust and centuries of forgetting reveal something else, a lingering evidence, subtle and insistent, carving out the edges of what was left behind. Tentative, almost hesitant, the material record rises in the intervals where the list is silent. Cylinder seals, delicately incised with cuneiform and image, are sometimes retrieved from a stratum now grey with the residue of time. Their surfaces catch the glint of late light, and their impressions summon names royal, regional, now half-remembered. These names do not always find home in the canonical register. Votive inscriptions, on clay or alabaster, dedicate acts or monuments. The words repeat their formal reverence for ruler and deity. The lines regular, the hand cautious and assured. Yet in the reading, there is the affront of absence, the recipient of such devotion, or the author of such prayers, unrecorded and unacknowledged in the formal sequence. Titles flicker through the breaks in language, asserting authority that the list does not echo. Monuments linger in ruin, their dedicatory formulae steady with certainty, but their protagonists are omitted, their stories folded into quietude. There is no chaos in this pattern of record and omission. The exclusions are particularly intimate in their selectiveness. Some kings, whose words endure in stone, whose image is pressed and preserved, are not transcribed among the official memory. Their monuments tell of conquest, of construction, of gifts to temples, gestures of rule, marks of prominence. Yet as you examine the inscribed faces of the list, these names are withheld, displaced by other presences deemed canonical. In shadowed contrast, it is not always the greatest who are effaced. Ephemeral rulers, those whose tenure was brief, whose power did not extend beyond narrow borders, may survive. Unexpectedly, in the list's progression, slipped in among dynasts, whose memory seems more stable. The pattern unsettles. It is not erasure at whim, not the random obliteration of history by time. It has, rather, the deliberate edge of curation, the faint but palpable touch of intent that shapes what endures and what falls to dust. The list, in its authority, chooses. Selection is itself a form of silence. Each name included generates a margin. Each title omitted deepens the surrounding hush. The texture of the record is not continuous, but pocked and scarred by decisions now unrecoverable. The writing of absence becomes as forceful as presence, the blank spaces, the tooled gaps. Summon your attention as much as the lines that pronounce who ruled and for how long. Here, the act of chronicling becomes nearly spectral. What is spoken stands in luminous relief against what is withheld, what is allowed to vanish. Where the list refuses to declare, the ground intervenes. Soil parts under the careful persistence of excavation, and fragments take air for the first time in centuries. Cylinder seals, once pressed in routine, now suggest alternate chronologies. Votive tablets, their script curling into the partially erased, propose affirmation of hands and lives now left out. These artifacts introduce parallel threads, unresolved and quiet, their arguments wordless but enduring. Just as often, the list proclaims where the earth is still, its kings unmarked by any surviving inscription, their rule substantiated only by these hollow words. The interplay is uneasy. Sometimes inscription fills the list's silence. Presence and absence spread across registers in uneasy parity, neither ever total, neither ever fully voided. The principle at work remains elusive, the principle always receding, inviting only speculation and never confirmation. What mechanism determined what the list would acknowledge and what it would consign to the clandestine? Authority, memory, accident, each guesses at the machinery behind selection, but the text does not clarify, the ground does not respond. You read, you compare, you unearth. The selective silence persists. Each collation of text and object, each juxtaposition of lists and artifacts, sharpens the sense of loss. The names that surface, emergent in clay or seal, reflect the faint possibility of countless others left unnamed, unclaimed, their stories both hinted and eclipsed by omission. The gaps intermittent, unexpected structure the memory as much as any inscribed word. To chronicle is to create silence as much as sound, absence as much as record. So you return, again, to the King List, again to the seals, again to the votive shards reading what has been saved, lingering in what has been denied, pressing gently on the uncertain margins. The corridor of memory is lit at intervals, Between the lights, the hush gathers. What governs what the list remembers and what it allows to fade away? The division was always assumed, quietly, almost without thought. There were stories of floods plaintive, repetitive, half buried in the language of myth, and there were deposits of silt, bands of sterile mud, pale horizons in the earth. Stories belonged to the imagined world, it was said. Layers belonged to the truth of things, material, mute, measurable. One category could be handled, documented. The other could only be retold. One was the whisper of disaster heard in the dark. The other, the mark it might have left, if at all. You find the quiet intake of air that comes with entering a tell at first light. The dust stirs around your feet, and the surface lies uneven, ancient, with moments of occupation sealed beneath fields of wind-blown loam. Somewhere below the topsoil, there is a break, a perplexing, clear boundary in the stratigraphic section, drawn not by human hand, but by an abrupt rising of water, by a force felt and then gone. It is recorded not in ink, but in silt. In several southern tells, the repetition appears again and again. The surface is carefully sliced back, a section revealed. At first, the ordinary pattern, the hum of occupation, the dull brown of domestic debris, sherds of recognizable pottery, bones, the usual tangled mass of human residue. Clean and abrupt. The color shifts. An alluvial deposit crowds out the evidence of human habitation. Heavy silt, fine and pale, unlike what lies above or below. The debris of people ashes, charcoal. Broken vessel suddenly gives way to a thick, stubborn stratum of waterborne sediment. Nothing of daily life persists in this band except what the flood has swept in or left behind. And then, above, habitation resumes different, or perhaps only apparently changed. The material of life returns, set atop what has been erased. Scribes once listed kings. Their records drew long chains of names, reigns, dynasties. At a certain point, the king list pauses. In its own language, calm and measured, it records a deluge. The list counts this flood as a fact among other facts, as if its waters moved through the world of rulers and successors, marking a threshold. But the list does not name a layer, does not gesture to a horizon of pale sediment or an ashen band. It moves from one reign to the next, through the flood, with only the words as proof that something changed. The deluge stands there, silent in the record, a word for what cannot be weighed or measured after the fact. Back in the earth, the occupation layers are read by those who know their absences. A phase of habitation ends. Sometimes, suddenly, above the old floor, an expanse of sterile mud. The pattern is always similar. Abandonment, then quiet, then the slow return, often with new forms of pottery, a slightly different construction of walls, an uneasy reset of things. The old is not quite continued. There is always a gap, marked by earth alone. The builder of the new phase rarely knows the silt they have built upon, how it came, or what was lost within it. Observers train themselves to see not only the layers, but their interruptions. Heavy silt, sometimes littered with remnants of the former world, splinters of wood, bruised bricks, distorted fragments of vessels. Sometimes the surface is reworked, marked by water, smoothed or churned, before silence fills the site again. The abandonment is rarely total. Evidence of hasty return is sometimes noted. A hearth rebuilt above the blankness. A scatter of new belongings in spaces just barely reclaimed from loss. Abandonment, rebuilding, reoccupation. Each phase, not quite aware of the one before, but each bound to the sediment below. The observer catalogues the depths, the thickness of the silt, the fragments embedded there, each measurement a gesture toward a history that refuses clarity. In the King List, the deluge holds its place among kings as a matter of course. Written in columns, the words render the flood as a threshold, not a problem to be solved. They offer position in a list, not explanation. And yet, in these lists, the water leaves nothing you can hold. No sediment, that will confirm the tale. Here, words bear the trace of water, but water itself is absent. In the tells, sediment accumulates, silent and absolute, but without a label, without a name, without even a whispered story. Your eyes adjusting to shade and contour, the line between living sediment and the heavy band left by water refuses to tell its full story. The field book records what can be seen and touched. Thickness, grain, composition, the modest reach of what can be measured. The rest is a silence, a pause, a break in continuity, marked by neither words nor deeds. Is this the echo of the flood from the list, translated into the language of Earth? Or is it only a rhythm found where rivers speak ancient patterns, indifferent to stories or lists? Memory sits just beyond reach, in the incomplete meeting of sediment and script. One is not cause of the other. Neither is the full record. All that is left is their convergence, a banded memory without author, a legend without audience, each incomplete, each awaiting the moment they might be thought together. The list sits quietly in the dust, enduring. It presents itself as a simple architecture of certainty. Royal names, stable and ordered, passing through the hush of centuries as if their syllables stand motionless, undisturbed by time. The accepted assumption is that each name is an unbroken thread, weaving reliably between epochs, a stable identifier, a self-contained vessel for memory. On the tablets, the names appear in arranged sequence, each one a stone in the river, identical to itself as it is passed from hand to hand, chisel to clay. The surface impression is calm, authoritative. These are the names, the record says. These are the kings. Here is the list. But names do not remain inert. Beneath the apparent stasis, the ground shifts. A slow, persistent movement becomes visible upon closer reading. What seems immutable, on a wider inspection, dissolves into motion. The script betrays tremors. Glyphs rewrite themselves by imperceptible degrees. On some tablets, the name is pressed with one sequence of signs elsewhere. The sequence wavers. Scribes copy, and in copying, introduce minute departures. A sound softened, a morpheme inserted, a divine sign added. What claims to be fixed is, at the margin, always drifting. It is not a rupture, but erosion, new syllables edging out old, familiar forms quietly evaporating. You turn the tablets beneath the lamplight. Attentive to these currents, in earlier layers, a name at first seems unremarkable, one compact shape, familiar under the stylus. Yet, when set beside its later neighbours, the name is no longer itself. Your eyes trace the emergence of a theophoric prefix, the arrival of a god's presence where none stood before. With each copy, sometimes centuries apart, the name's boundaries blur, absorbing echoes from cults, from foreign soils. The forms, once so clear, begin to ripple. A stem shivers, a prefix attaches, vowels tilt. Even the sign order, once deemed inviolate, rises in alternate configurations. Where one tablet records a name in 4 shaped signs, another records it in 3, or arranges them in a ghostly permutation that both is and is not the same. Supposed likeness turns ambiguous. A pair of names, etched side by side in a reference list, look almost identical in Roman script, yet, upon close comparison, the underlying cuneiform tells another story. The variant spellings, faint but documented, endure in the arcane tally of the scribal schools. Each school, in its silent training, preserves a census of proper names, lists etched for the learning of hands that would record anew what is always slightly unmoored. The evidence accumulates across lexical lists, columns of name forms, shifting in symmetry and sound, catalogued by those who perhaps sensed, quietly, what could never be said aloud. There is no final version. No name stands forever. There are names that call out as place names in other sources, a resonance not easily dismissed. Early in the list, a handful of entries coincide with toponyms found elsewhere, locations transformed into royal identities, or perhaps the other way around. Later, that migration continues not by geography, but by theology. The record renders a transformation. What was once only a name becomes an invocation, spelling the divine in leaden clay. The accumulation is methodical, yet indistinct. Each scribe records what is seen, but what is seen is not consistent. What is inscribed is not unchanging. Hand's shape echoes more than originals. Nothing in the evidence suggests mere error. There are no excisions, no confessions in the margin. The alternate forms are recorded, collated, and recopied with a precision that suggests intention, or at the very least acceptance. The list holds the names, but the names do not hold still. The tradition fixes the roster, the archive preserves the line, yet every transcription is a shallow tide, shifting sand beneath the standing stones. The air grows thick with the silence left between iterations, the sense that what matters is not what is written once, but the trace of each departure from the last, and the uncertainty such departures introduce into the record's heart. In the hush of the archive, the observer is left with the drift, names moving while the list grips them in its unmoving fist. Catalogues, prepared by hands long vanished, enshrine this ambiguity in orderly rows. Scribes, conscious or not, have allowed motion into the very structure meant to prevent it. The line breaks, repairs itself, and breaks again. Meaning accumulates in the gap, not just in the form. Every variant stands as a witness not only to language, but to silence. You stand before the name rows even now, aware that memory and inscription do not perfectly align. Loss and presence are both inscribed in every iteration. The night presses in, and the tablets rest within their dust. The list endures, but the names wander without anchor, luminous and unsettled, refusing to be held within a single shape for long. How should a list keeper reconcile the silent migration of names with the enduring stillness of the list? The surface is smooth, time-beaten, but the words linger. There is an assumption, weathered yet persistent, settling itself upon the dust of archives and the hollowed echo of rooms that once held a murmur of instruction. That which is taught is that which is true. The lesson, unbroken, slides forward. Hands learn by repetition. Minds receive by tracing. Copying itself becomes a vehicle for fact. The content of history passes down, unchanged, known, unfiltered by exercise. The path from scribe to scribe is envisioned as seamless, a transparent transmission of what was into what will be remembered. Yet there is a slippage, nearly silent, a resistance to clarity. Left in the silence of clay and dispassionate scribe, residues surface at the edges, not in the open, not declared, but found in the remains. There are practice tablets, thick with repetitive lines, shorn of context, bilingual lexical lists, side by side, languages knitted by a mechanical gesture, names of kings, pressed again and again, sometimes incomplete, sometimes oddly spaced, sometimes truncated as if the line lost interest before history did. What was an exercise? What a memory? What intention was kept or lost in the moment of copying? A narrow bench. A pupil bends, stylus hovering over the wet clay. The teacher waits, silent. Another pupil, unseen, works nearby. The day moves slowly, the light shifting. There are tablets stacked beneath a layer of dust, with royal names listed one after the next, yet the sequence stutters. Names missing, others repeated. A series of numerals, set apart, calculated not to record tribute or event, but to test the hand. A rhythm that does not match the order of happenings, that dances just outside narrative. These practice exercises survive in the refuse of classrooms, buried not by intention but by routine discard. And still, millennia later, we receive them as evidence exercises without conclusion, fragments of a practiced memory, none of them quite unbroken. Allow the evidence to settle around you. Preservation does not always mean fidelity. The surface of the clay tells only of impression, not of content. Bilingual lists a king's name in Sumerian, a name again in Akkadian. Not every name appears. Not every ordering is honoured. There is abbreviation, omission, repetition. all shaped by the invisible, unspoken hand of the teacher who decides. Some exercises are kept, others abandoned to erosion, to disappearance. The act of copying is filtered by pedagogical priorities. What is saved? What is erased? Where is meaning assigned or forgotten? It is tempting to believe the list, always capitalized, always severe, exists as a document of only remembrance, only accuracy. But these surviving tablets, battered and interrupted, refuse such ease. Instead, they propose a text that serves double duty, a lesson to be practiced, an artifact to be carried. On the next, a mathematical schema. The names become cipher and signature, only sometimes tethered to event, often shorn loose, adrift in the current of instruction. The teacher, presence unseen, selects exemplars. The pupil learns the forms, not the fullness of what the name holds. At the meeting place where instruction fuses with record, where memory is trained by rote, where the list's authority thins a subtle reshaping, the sequence narrows, is trimmed, occasionally misaligns with the broader tapestry of known sovereigns. Numeration exercises run parallel, not intersecting, not joining the onward march of annals. The purpose of the text fractures, shifts. Linearity gives way to repetition. Narrative bows to pedagogy. The silence speaks along the tablet's edge. Gaps multiply. Truncation hides as much as it reveals. Some hands write, other hands decide what is worth recording, what will lie dormant beneath classroom floors until found, a cut strand of memory, laid bare. In the margin between training and record, the list is both and neither. It holds what is chosen, loses what is not rehearsed. Time accrues layers, smoothing intentions. The exercise context hovers the anticipation of skill, the urgency of passing a lesson. The names, the numbers, the lists, the lines, all shift imperceptibly under the weight of use. Dust deepens, the stylus dries, the clay hardens. What persists is ambiguous, part record, part echo. The evidence remains, lying quietly in drawers, unremarked until noticed, uncertain in its scope. Only fragments drift forward. You hold the remains in your mind, turning them slowly, testifying to a process that both conserves and distorts. In the hush of the storeroom, the nocturne of cuneiform, the ultimate question lingers, unhurried, unresolved. What is a text that serves both as training and as memory? There is the accepted assumption, quietly persistent, seldom challenged. The King List, it is said, stands alone a solitary document, a genre unto itself, isolated, distinct among the forms of record that gather like dust in the corner of a ruined hall. The list, we repeat, is not like the hymns that praise kings, not like the inscriptions built into foundations, not like the omen texts that tremble at the shapes of past and future. It records, but it does not sing. It notes, but it does not intone. It is a line, not a web. This is the belief, handed down in margins, quietly annotated, rarely reconsidered. Yet, in the thickening silence between these tablets and their mirrors, comparison pulls softly at the edges. When two surfaces are held close, two records, one ancient and eroded, another copied in a different century, their languages nearly twins, yet not quite, the separation blurs. Boundaries seem for a moment less certain than their defenders imagined. In a kingly hymn, there is a phrase. Kingship descends from the heavens, chooses a city, bestows its favour. The words may shift in their cadence, their alignment, a syllable added or left in the silt. Yet something remains. The list, in its clipped register, alludes again. Kingship granted. Cities adorned with the yoke of rule. Foundation inscriptions echo the same structure, sometimes with only a gesture, a ghost of a grammar. What is preserved is not sameness, but resonance, the timbre of kingship, the act of bestowal, the chain that links ruler, city, and fated moment. The evidence accumulates in fragments, as all evidence does. Tablets, etched with stylus, sometimes cracked at the edge, sometimes overwritten with corrections. Some were placed in the foundations of walls, intended as silent witnesses to building and destruction alike. Others are copies, texts rewritten by later hands, their script tensed with the effort of imitation, their knowledge partial, sometimes willfully incomplete. To observe these surfaces is to observe what is both present and erased. Names recur. Some are repeated in inscriptions centuries apart, their numbers curiously absent, as if the quantity of rain, the years measured, can be omitted without loss. The numerical silence is as present as the name itself, perhaps more so, an opening into the uncertainty of what memory records and what it allows to dissolve. Omen texts operate under another kind of invocation. In their cataloguing of portents and consequences, they reach for figures from the list, but not for data. Legendary kings become exemplar, points of reference, but not calculation. The invocation is enough. The numbers are unnecessary. These texts cite, but do not recount. They recall, but do not enumerate. Shadows of the list move across their surfaces, thin but indelible. What remains, when one text gestures toward another, is the articulation of citation and omission. The chain of reference grows more complex, looping through the absence as well as the presence of the King List's entries. Sometimes the echo is explicit, a phrase nearly mirrored. Sometimes it is no more than a frame, the act of remembering, or of refusing to remember. The transmission is incomplete by design or by accident. It is impossible to be certain. There are moments when what is omitted carries more weight than what is included, when silence emphatically signals meaning, however opaque. The network becomes visible only in this blinking, half-lit way. Phrases stranded in hymn and inscription, echoes misaligned by time, invocations hollowed out by the loss of context. The list is a node never isolated, never sovereign, always caught in this web of borrowing, of reframing, of selected forgetting. The idea of a genre dissolves as you peer more closely. Bounded forms cede to gradients, boundaries worn thin by repetition and elision alike. Each textual reference, each gap, is a kind of threshold inviting the observer to pause, uncertain at the edge, to consider not only what is written, but what lingers behind the writing. Memory itself becomes an act that is equally present in silence and in utterance. There are chains of text, but their links are incomplete. Each node, marked or unmarked, retains the potential to disrupt the line, to draw the web tighter, or to let it slacken into absence. The list stands, not as a solitary monument, but as a fragment woven into a broader memoryscape, eroded by time, but continually reinscribed through echo and omission. Touching each tablet, you sense both what endures and what withdraws. The gaps speak, offering no resolution, only the reminder that every citation is also a refraction, every echo uncertain in its origin and its effect. Where do these echoes lead? The accepted vision settles in the mind's eye, almost without resistance, that artifacts, especially those handled and marked by many hands, will dutifully echo the stories once written, spoken, and passed through the corridors of officiated memory. That the clay, impressed by seal and intention, mirrors the enduring claims of order and lineage. It is a comfortable symmetry material and text, each confirming the other's persistence. For regimes that spoke in the language of centuries, it becomes almost reflexive to search the ground for seals that answer, year after year, to the rulers' names and boasts inscribed elsewhere. Yet this expectation, so stable in its reiteration, finds itself quietly unsettled in the measured spaces of the archive. Thousands of seal impressions wait, preserved in earth-toned fragments, lying against one another in trays and careful tiers, each bearing the silent mark of its own passage. They carry names, some familiar, some strange, titles that claim authority, or simply witness, glyphs and signs that move between the known and the unknowable. Stylistic patterns radiate outward, some motifs traced for generations, their forms just recognizable beneath the slow abrasion of dust and time. Others fade or vanish entirely, motifs replaced, meanings perhaps unmade, their usage sealed by the unhurried drift from one era into the next. The impressions themselves do not speak in paragraphs. Their record holds not narrative, but repetition. The same image, pressed anew, on fresh clay. In each handling, each impression fixes a moment transaction, authorization, the silent acknowledgement of presence and office. Recovered impressions lie together, arrayed by context, shrink-wrapped by circumstance, abstracted from their original urgency. Some impressions are sharp, clean-edged, as if made only yesterday. Others blur, fissured by time or the uneven pressure of long-vanished fingers. Each one was meant not for posterity, but for a brief, administrative certainty. Cross-referenced against the written lists that bear the names of rulers. Sometimes a name on a seal coincides with a name inscribed as a king, a scribe, an overseer. Sometimes not. The clay ledger is uninterested in endorsement. It records only presence, not importance. What persists is not always what is claimed. Seal after seal, motif after motif, there is endurance, but not continuity without interruption. The stylistic sequences, so meticulously recorded by those who study such minutiae, display their own rhythms. In an unexpected context, the line is not unbroken. There are gaps, breaks in the chain of impression, hiatuses that do not match the formal longevity ascribed by king lists or remembered reigns. Some motifs vanish for generations, then reappear, slightly altered, a faint echo of earlier forms. Others end in silence. The evidence is not absence, but a kind of withheld presence, a shadow where expectation seeks substance. The regime, as inscribed in the list, unfolds as a continuum, a procession of names stretching beyond the plausible reach of memory. In the clay, only partial echoes linger. The seals do not demonstrate uninterrupted authority. Their authority is always partial, particular, time-bound. Yet, even as they fragment, the impressions keep their own ordered record, unrelated to the grander claims elsewhere inscribed. In the cool, controlled light of the archive, each seal impression is catalogued, described in careful detail. Measurement, surface, clarity of impression, residue from finger or cord. They are indexed, as if the accumulation itself might one day yield an answer to the question of continuity. The repeated lines of the glyptic art, even as they decline and renew, mark the rhythm of usage, but never the march of regime as laid down in text. The daily practice of pressing, rolling, marking these gestures are administrative, immediate, disconnected from the sweep of mythic chronology. There is a silence behind the registry, a stillness in the room, in which names faintly remembered are juxtaposed with names lost, offices, once essential, now indecipherable. The archive accumulates impression upon impression. No two sequences fully align. The administrative memory, shaped through daily service, endures in detail, even as its context dissolves. What then remains when the motifs outlive the names, or when names outlast their signs? Does the slow continuity of images bear any relation to the discontinuity of reign and claim? Does the register of clay marks tell the same story as the list? The fragments persist in silence, refusing to draw the unbroken line the lists demand. The questions accumulate like dust across trays, like the shallow depressions on the surface of clay impressions, their meanings shaped by absence as much as by form. How does the quiet regularity of enduring images bear witness to the fractures implicit in the dreams of endless rule? There is a comfortable assumption, long-standing and quietly recited. Time leaves traces that match its passing, technology accumulating in careful measure as years unfold. It is an axis that reassures chronological length reflected in the steady progress of craft. Layer after layer, it is expected that ceramic forms will rise, shift, and recede, that metal yields itself first in simple shapes, then in complexity, that the ways a wall is set upon stone will intimate the duration of habitation. There is discipline in this belief, One material century becomes the next, and so the artifact draws its silent measurement of reigns and generations. It is almost a lullaby, this linearity, softly ordering the chaos beneath dust and stone. Yet, attentive silence holds another rhythm. There is a phase, adjacent to foundations set down for kings whose names sit in lists. A phase in which the expected ease of transitions falls away. The ground yields up evidence in hesitant sequence. Sherds of fired clay, pale and patterned, not quite as their predecessors. Metal pieces, a brace or a blade, emerge from the soil with edges unfamiliar, forged in ways that escape the rules drafted in older typologies. Mortared stones, in low courses, no longer reflect the measured straightness of previous generations, but rather a tendency to suit shifting techniques. Small ruptures evidencing incremental ingenuity. The presence and weight of change are uneven, never withdrawn, and yet not uniformly distributed. Time, in these layers, refuses to measure itself by the equivalence of technique and chronology. What is seen, in the record, is a hesitation, a rhythm that toggles between innovation and stasis, advance and holding. In one stratum, a bowl's handle is drawn like a memory from older forms. In the next, its profile thins, betraying a kiln worked under new rules. The catalogue notes the angle, the glaze, the section, as if these details, archived and fixed, might one day reveal duration. Metal artifacts are catalogued with patient hands, pigments brushed from their surfaces, their composition read out in cold instrument and quiet breath. Lines are traced in ledgers, alloy, fracture, mode of casting, all laid beside the ruler's attributed years. But the ledgers do not settle doubt. They preserve it. They do not force the evidence to comply with the great sweep of kings, their reigns stretching beyond the lifetimes of these practice-bound objects. Architectural features receive the same methodical attention, notched and measured, stones weighted, binding materials sampled, construction angles compared. Each shift in technique whispers its own interval, short or long, casual or careful. Not all sequences are smooth. The transformation of firing, the movement from hand-molded to wheel-shaped, opens a fracture in the expectation of a gentle incline. Metallurgy does not align itself to duration. Sometimes a sudden bloom of diversity hints at a compressed interval of intense practice. Elsewhere, a return to older forms intrudes, refusing the story of uninterrupted innovation. Architecture, too, resists seamless accounting. Foundations are rebuilt, sometimes hastily, with mixed methods. A wall's lower course speaks one dialect of stonework, its upper another, the transition a thin scar drawn by necessity or by the shifting weight of knowledge itself. In every dimension of the archaeological record, the material insists on its own timeline. The pace veers, stalls and surges within the span of an attributed reign, leaving those who catalogue and number, who turn sherd and blade in lamplight, tracing only the residue of choice and adaptation, not of relentless, linear time. The record, written and rewritten in artifact and ledger, holds tension. Here are the lists. Kings, their days ceaselessly tallied, generations stretching backwards beyond recall. Here, beside the names, is the evidence footprints of transformation. The forms do not cling to a singular identity. They mutate, drift, compound, sometimes collapse, and all within a period the list renders stable, monumental, unchanging. What is to be done with the friction that arises when the measured craft contradicts the recorded magnitude? The ceramicist's report offers thickness and curve. The metallurgist's log offers phase and alloy. The architect's plan records angle and span, but they do not resolve the duration inscribed by the record-keeper's hand. Those who observe are left in the interval between the artifact as a practice, a record of hands repeating and revising, and the list as a magnitude, an edifice of time, stretched to improbable dimensions. Each object remains weighted by its making, each technique by its utility or moment, not by the placeholder of royal succession. The material memory is not infinite, nor is it smooth. It preserves the trace of an action, a pot formed, a blade struck, a wall mortared, not an inalterable count of years. Change stands beside claimed continuity, folding silence into the sediment, contradiction into the catalogue. In quiet rooms, the evidence sits beneath glass, elusive, both present and insufficient, a record of practice doubly shadowed by the magnitude it cannot fill. In this silence, the dust settles again. Time leans against itself. Only the measured witness, the bowl, the blade, the wall, remains to bear the uncertainty. One assumption, quietly inherited and seldom interrogated, that named dynasties on the list ruled alone, each rising only as its predecessor fell, each reigning unchallenged through its prescribed span. The list, lined with names, gives an order that is tidy, contiguous, complete. There is comfort in this lineage, one king giving way to another, the singular crown passed from hand to hand, power flowing in a thin, unbroken line through time's murk. Such is the story the list would tell you if you let it. And for a moment you might believe it too. A sequence of rulers without interruption, the years parcelled along a solitary thread. Then, over stone and under dust, the ground speaks another language, quiet but insistent. Not in the clarion of proclamation, but in the muted vocabulary of survey, chance find, stray inscription. There are layers beneath the strata of the list fragments, notations, obscure reliefs. Here, evidence settles out of silence. A clay tablet marked with protocol, sealed with an unfamiliar motif, buried alongside others whose origin the list does not record. One seal impression preserves the title of authority, attributed to a name found nowhere in the sequence, its formula diverging subtly but unmistakably. A letter, unmoored from its sender, records a diplomatic overture to a city whose oversight is supposed to be impossible in this year, this reign, this supposed dominion. You turn the fragment, read its cuneiform in careful light. Trade tallies, uneven and incomplete, surface from the margins of these kingly ages. Simple entries, grain, livestock, labour, are itemized under administrations not sanctioned by the canonical lists. Yet the handwriting is local, the calculations precise, the implication unmistakable. Here, a transaction is recorded under one official's name. There, a contemporaneous document attributes authority to a different, parallel administration. Strata meant to belong to one reign yield artifacts of many, sometimes together, sometimes apart, always resisting the grace of sequence. Even as the list claims singularity, the soil reveals multiplicity pressed within the same horizon. Ceilings side by side, the ink not yet dry on either. The surveyor's pen draws boundaries, but on the ground the lines blur and merge. A city's walls rise in one period, yet its market tokens reflect exchanges across polities, nuanced by the vocabulary of more than one royal court. Inscribed doorjambs and administrative tablets overlap in their chronology. Each bears silent witness to systems operating in tandem, sometimes in friction, never in isolation. The list's authority, a record of names, dates, rules, presupposes a sequence. But the fabric of administration, as found, quietly resists such neat delineation. You move through the catalogue, each box labelled with reign and year, but within boxes, provenance phrase. A shard bears a seal whose formula is irreconcilable with its layer, an artifact at odds with the registry's order. Gaps emerge, intentional omissions, or lost entries between list and remnant. There are periods without kings, declared in the margins, yet etched into the clay are minor authorities, parallel stewards, unnamed actors whose jurisdiction was not erased in practice, even if it is in memory. Overlap sits within overlap administrative formulae, dialect, weight, and measure, tracing a palimpsest only partly effaced. Diplomatic records, preserved in slivers, document overtures to neighbours but also to rivals, neither conquered nor remembered as kin. A missive acknowledges a gift received from a regime undreamed of by the chronicler of the list. In inventories and tallies, seals repeat with minor deviation, one administration's signet, another's close beside it. Within the same stratum, discontinuity whispers. The singular tale of succession gives way, under gentle scrutiny, to an array of voices, each tentative, each incomplete. Among these remains, the list continues to insist its sequence is preserved, only occasionally annotated with hesitancy or uncertainty, never with contradiction. The archival voice, measured and remote, offers a unity that simplifies the layered experience beneath it. What survives of the administrative residue, however, is more ambiguous, more crowded, more uncertain. Even in absence, traces persist, citations, corrections, notes added later in other hands, all registering glimpses of what did not fit, could not be catalogued, was not meant to be remembered except in the shadows of the record. What is it, then, that we speak of when we list kings? When the ground preserves their coexistence alongside those they were meant to replace, it is easy to accept the pattern as given. Later kings look back. They summon the presence of their predecessors, and through citation they legitimize themselves. There is the widely held belief, calm, almost automatic, that each invocation of a former name is a gesture toward continuity, a reassurance of unbroken tradition. One ruler points to another in careful words etched in stone or pressed into clay, and in that gesture, the story seems straight, running from past to present, each king borrowing gravitas from those who came before. It is assumed, almost silently, that by these acts, a phrase, a recited ancestry, the line is made whole and history is preserved intact. As the evidence itself is laid bare, the royal inscriptions that survive, whether from the long shadow of the second millennium or the closer reach of the first, do not offer neat sequences or whole rosters. Instead, they reveal compositional acts, naming, selecting, shaping. Some kings invoke earlier figures and announce descent, or speak of restoration. But what is offered is not a complete account. Rather, there are fragments recited in ceremonial formulae and gaps that quietly widen between the chosen names. Each citation compresses time. Each invocation omits stretches of line and clouds the memory of those left unnamed. What the evidence admits is methodical, deliberate curation. The surviving texts, inscribed, archived, sealed, sometimes reburied, exhibit selective reappearance of figures drawn from the older list, always incomplete, never whole. Names resurface, almost ritualistically, as though lifted from a long catalogue, yet each appearance arrives with precise intention. Others are silent, never spoken, consigned to spaces where no hand reached to recover or record. Genealogies are reshaped, links strengthened or collapsed by the force of omission. It is an act of archival retrieval, and at once of erasure. In the act itself, a rhythm is felt: selection, repetition, compression, omission. A king establishes his line, not by the entirety of the past, but by fragments. Memory is curated, not a continuous, breathing line, but a constructed monument of selective recall. It is as if, within the dust and twilight of the archives, memory is less an unbroken thread, and more a mosaic, rearranged with each generation, altered by each act of citation. Each inscription stands, not as objective record, but as an index of retrieval, and silence, each word a retrieval, each gap a quiet exclusion. One observes the form, the stone slab, the clay cylinder. There is formality, and yet, beneath the surface, an instability. The names arrayed are not the live record of memory, but the relics of a selection process. To read these documents is to witness an ongoing act of arrangement. The older figures are not simply recovered, but repositioned carefully, made to fit a structure serving present needs. A genealogy unfurls, but only certain strands are illuminated by the stylus, others left in deepening shadow. In the residue of kingship, only some are summoned into light. Others recede further with each passing reign, becoming unavailable, almost invisible. There is a narrowing of memory, a paring away. The list remains as one document, but what is chosen by later hands determines which portion of its history survives into renewed inscription. Some are reanimated in words, others entombed by omission. The very process of citation is formulaic, a ritual reinforced by the logic of precedent, yet shaped by instrumental aims. There is no full preservation, only preservation shaped by what is deemed usable. Names not selected become indistinct, pressed flat beneath layers of later inscription and later still silence. The records compress history, collapsing decades or centuries into a name, a claimed link, a purported restoration. The pattern becomes visible, remembrance as a tool, restoration as a constructed bridge, the past arranged as resource. When reading such texts, one is both witness and archaeologist, handling the residue not only of power, but of memory's partial survival. There is restraint within the writing, names included and names bypassed. The ceremonial phrasing covering what is left unsaid. The archive is both presence and absence, revealing not simply what was once held dear, but the gradual process of sifting and discarding. So it is, with each later text, that the past is picked over, set in a new light, sometimes bright, sometimes indistinct. It is a matter of arrangement, what to keep, what to allow to settle into dust. Time acts not as a preserver, but as an organizer, guiding which voices rise and which fall away. You stand at the threshold of what is preserved and what is lost, hearing nothing but the silent echo of choices made at many removes from your present. Each name inscribed is a survivor, each gap a silent decision, weighted by the hands and eyes who curated the record. You see what remains, but not what was possible. Standing amid the ruins of citation, there is only the faint trace of presence, held uneasily between memory and omission, and one must ask, in the deep quiet after the last line, what happens to rulers who are not picked up by later hands? The accepted belief settles itself across the field of inquiry with the weight of composure. The idea, quietly repeated, that Mesopotamian calendrical systems deliver continuity to the work of historical dating. The notion is not questioned, not often. It is inherited, assumed, and passed between hands with the sureness reserved for tools long used. One stands before the past, certain that the months progress with order, the years accrue, stones counting shadow after shadow. Time, in this formulation, is measured, disciplined, inscribed a floor on which the house of history is raised. Fragments remain where the floor has cracked, not the cloth of calendar as a seamless record, but something partial, momentary, dissonant. Scattered lunar records, tablets smoothed and marked with traces of intercalation, lie in the dust. They are not memorials or manifestos, not grand declarations, but practical notations, domestic and administrative. They recur in omen compendia, drifting on the margins of more imposing texts. A month adjusted, a period extended, not always with explanation, not always with notice. The calendar, here, fractures into localities, each one asserting its own silence. The evidence does not gather into the expected harmony. Instead, it crumbles apart, setting its own unsteady pulse. Pressed between lists of accounts and grain, bound to the inventory of ritual acts, a sequence of month names appears, then dissolves. Some are simple, others drift untethered, naming only what liturgy demands, cultic acts unconcerned with a ruler's tally. Administrative tablets speak softly, half swallowed by clay's reluctance to preserve each word. The accumulations are uneven, sometimes dense, sometimes hollow, as though what mattered most resisted inscription. The season changes, but the record does not always reveal how. Years are named, not numbered. Their passing is dated by deeds, not by the arithmetic of reigns. So much remains unaligned. The schedule keeps its own rhythm, not the stately progression of dynasties or regnal enumeration. Practicality outpaces ceremony. The record keeper marks a sacrifice. The witness notes the storing of barley, but the wider clock of monarchs and empires falls silent. Ritual calendars settle into grooves of practice, some months stretching, some shrinking, according to need. Intercalation, that ancient remedy for the wandering moon, is enforced with irregular hesitance, a solution taken up and set aside, to be remembered only as a fragment, never as a rule. What arrives in the present is not a single thread, but a mesh of lines, broken, tangled, each insistent on its own logic. The assumption recedes as evidence rises, timid, incomplete, contradictory. How many times did a festival drift along the lunar edge, waiting for the alignment that would not come? How many years were counted not as years, but as the memory of a construction, the echo of a dedication, the shadow of a harvest stripped clean? The calendar does not heed narrative chronology. It walks adjacent, and apart, and those who would use it for reckoning find the ledgers slipping from their hands. You return, again and again, to what persists. Small remnants, brief calculations, adjustments justified by matters now mute. Something of the archival voice lingers here, weighted with the knowledge that much has been lost. What was written was meant to serve a moment's purpose, not to endure interrogation across millennia. The calendrical intervals, once obvious, grow obscure. Context falls away. These fragments do not synchronize. They do not resolve. They endure only as traces, partial gestures toward what the pattern might once have been. The silence hums along the gaps, the omitted, the ambiguous. The absent all speak as loudly as what is catalogued. Sometimes a month is renamed for a rain that did not fall. Sometimes a year exists only as an edge, barely notched into the periphery of another. The memory of each calculation, each intercalary choice, has faded, buried beneath the silt of centuries, pressed out by new hands, forgotten in name, but persistent in residue. What does it mean, then, to translate a rhythm that has slipped so thoroughly from memory? It is quietly assumed the earth will confirm or deny the measures of time set down in chronicles and reigns. You are told to expect a direct correspondence, a one-to-one relationship between human presence and the climate's mute record. Let the soil speak, and it will answer cleanly a confirmation, a contradiction, a neat alignment of absence and presence. The old belief rests on a promise of clarity. If the sediments are layered, and these layers are ordered, then the record should be decipherable, unambiguous in its voice. The environment shapes, records, and sometimes forecloses. The promise lingers. Look to the pollen, the stalagmite, the silted basin, and you need not ask twice. And so, the field turns to the evidence already held in the Earth's slow archive. The envoys are familiar, quietly persistent in their detail and indifference. Pollen cores drawn from silent marshes, their story revealed in grains too small to name. They conjure sequences of aridity and moisture, bands of time recorded not in narrative but in gradations of dust and growth. Beside them, the speleothems stalagmites, rising in limestone darkness, their surfaces accumulating the ghostly calculus of centuries. Each drip, each trace of mineral carried through water, a long register of seasons now vanished. And the basins, lakes alternately swollen and shrunken, old shorelines etched into the mud, their contours preserved in patterns of clay, silt, and fading organics. There is no announcement here, no event marked with flourish. Only changes, measured, implacable, written over and over with no hand visible. Cores are extracted with deliberate care, each segment transported into a clean silence above ground. Their layers unfold under the microscope, a composition, a quiet arrangement of forms. The earlier bands are dense with arthritic grains, traces of drought, times when grasses choke and deserts threaten to advance. Higher layers hold the swelling of wetter years, dense with arboreal signatures, the return of leaf and canopy. Periods of abrupt transition appear suddenly, a thinning of pollen, the incursion of foreign species, an implication of violence neither named nor forgotten. It is not chronology in the royal sense, but a kind of memory. The evidence is tangible, yet resists simple accounting. Elsewhere, deep beneath the earth where light cannot enter, the speleothems continue their slow accretion. Record keepers enter these cool hollows, chisel away at the stone with reverence, transport thin cross-sections into the laboratory's blue-white illumination. There, growth rings are read as annual increments, a sedimentary biography. Some bands thicken, dense with trace elements, testimony to years of abundant water. Others shrink or lapse, thin and pale as the trickle above dries. The record oscillates, abrupt events deposited in stark contrast to the steady rhythm of centuries. A gap appears. Another begins. The stone does not record intention, nor does it yield reasons. Upon the lake's edge, mud tells its own story. Sediments accumulate in patient layers, interrupted by bands of sand, charcoal, matted detritus. In laboratory trays, shoreline shifts are reconstructed, each elevation carefully marked and compared. The evidence is layered as a backdrop, not a chronology of power or names. Basins alternate from drought-cracked silence to flooded excess. Some intervals are gradual, the difference almost imperceptible, a slow drift of patterns. At other times, a sudden breach, a precipitous decline, a shoreline lost, a sign that something unspoken has transpired. Yet no human name is inscribed in the clay, no rain traced in the ripple of silt. What these archives offer is neither verdict nor refutation, but a scene set in ambiguity. The climate's record crosses paths with archaeological absence. Here a period of abandonment, there a subtle emptiness. The occupation faded, not erased. Occasionally, several records align an abrupt climatic event, matching a stretch of silence in the artifacts, a vacancy in the material presence traced by looters and scholars alike. Elsewhere, the temporalities meander. The earth suggests a shift, slow and patient, but the human record is fractured, scattered, incomplete. One sequence tallies rainfall, another counts years by dynasties, kings, transitions scarcely remembered. Their intersections are at once tantalizing and austere. Description gives way to juxtaposition, not explanation. When these sedimentary archives and the written documents diverge, tension holds. Both remain preserved, neither erased nor subsumed. Their disagreement resists synthesis. You see in the sample jar and in brittle texts the same dual testimony, each assured in its own terms, each approaching reality at a slant. What is measured in bands of nitrates and silicic residues cannot be matched to letters carved in stone or ink pressed into frayed parchment. The meters and the histories run parallel, glancing off each other without resolution. All that persists is the background, the silent pressure that circumscribes possibility. Human activity floats in this sedimentary dusk, patterns repeating, opportunities opening and foreclosing as water rises and recedes. The archive neither forgives nor confirms. It maintains its own rhythm, a slow counterpoint to the narratives told above. What exists is an atmosphere of waiting, traces both abundant and spare never quite yielding. There is no certitude, only the patient accumulation of what remains. Paleoclimatic markers blur the lines between loss and memory, presence and absence, sequence and story. They mark a threshold, a place before and after, now and then. The soil's silence becomes its evidence. What is left unsaid carries its own weight. How do you hold together an archive of sediment and a sequence of names when neither account will yield? It is quietly assumed, almost instinctively, with the patience of centuries, that what is written in hard, enduring substance will echo what the softer, more vulnerable medium has carried to us. Stone and metal, chosen for their hardness, for their capacity to outlast the shifting surface of clay, should act as mirrors to the lists incised on tablets. The reflex persists. If a ruler is recorded in clay, surely a corresponding mark in stone must bear that same name, the same lineage, maybe even the same reach of years. This is the comfort of cross-reference, the hope that durability means consensus. Yet, observation tells its own story. As you move from the brittle clarity of baked slip to the dense, cool permanence of basalt or hammered copper, the pattern fractures. There are names preserved in the burdened weight of a stele, swollen slightly by the chisel's reverence. And there are names that remain only where clay was pressed and dried and buried. Rarely, these bodies of evidence touch perhaps a given honorific, perhaps a remark about ancestry, but the overlap is partial, the mirroring incomplete. The oldest names of the list look out from clay with a certain expectant silence, while their existence in epigraphic substance is sporadic at best, marked less by the fullness of rain than by the hint of commemoration. Where a correspondence can be drawn, it tends to be genealogical. Son of, father, to, ancestor, or descendant. Regnal numbers, those confident spans of influence and time, mostly recede in stone, vibrantly absent where they are elsewhere so bold. You see the material palette, grey-green schists, slabs scratched delicately or hammered in relief, small dedicatory blades, seals meant to outlast the hands that pressed them. Each is deliberate, weighted more towards honour, memorial, invocation, reverence, than the clinical recording of duration. When inscribers took up the stylus or the chisel, their acts diverged. What is sustained in fired clay might be lost in stone. What remains in copper is chosen, not exhaustive. The archive begins to split here, not in a moment of rupture, but in the gentle, almost unnoticeable drift caused by choices of medium and moments of attention. Is a name chiseled by its length of reign, or by the memory it was meant to evoke, the occasion it was pressed to commemorate? One form leans toward the mathematics of time, the other drifts into the artistry of selection. Fragments accumulate. The stele is partial, often broken corners worn, incisions faded, the context ambiguous or erased. Dedicatory objects surface from earth or demolition, survivors less of intent than of accident. They are monuments of selective memory, assembled not as an inventory but a field of emphasis. They do not measure time. They do not insist upon completeness. They offer what permanence has singled out for curation. They provide the names, the durable hands of artisans believed worthy of the slow, unhurried erosion of centuries. Where clay lists seek to enumerate, to present the figures and successions in an orderly file, the epigraphic record encodes praise and position, parentage and favour, but not necessarily the stretch of seasons that defined a reign. The result is a kind of archival discontinuity, many-layered and quiet, the dusty hush of the tablet room, the cold echo where a slab is found exposed to night. Each gives a different geometry of memory. There are witnesses implied in the surviving traces. The scribe, the inscriber, the caretaker, the reader centuries later, trying to see through the scuffed palimpsest of meaning. Their intentions are not inscribed, only implied. Often, the only certainty is uncertainty, measured by what surviving traces fail to say. There is a sense, unhurried and incomplete, that every medium, clay, stone, copper, presents its own borders of loss. Not everything is meant to travel into the future. Not every name will be paired with every figure, every date with every claim. Sometimes, the lists in clay speak a litany that the stela cannot echo. Sometimes, the hard inscription preserves what the tablet has let go. A record is no longer singular, but pluralized by matter and moment. Genealogical tendrils extend a son, a father, a dynasty nodded to in low relief, while time itself vanishes into the stone's silence. The act of commemorating becomes less than an arithmetic of years, more than mere record-keeping. There is memorializing that chooses emphasis, and an attention that fractures meaning along the grain of what endures. What has regnal time to do with what permanence chooses to remember? How much of the list is shaped by the needs or accidents of what can last? Observation circles back again and again. The archivist compares, hesitates, catalogues the partials. You can feel the tension between what ought to have been corroborated in stone and what, in fact, fractured and faded away. The shadow of each name stretches across media, sometimes landing, sometimes missing altogether, sometimes flickering between mention and omission. There is an accumulative silence that lingers between every overlapping record, between every confident list and every weathered inscription. At the threshold between the stone's durable echo and the clay's brittle preservation, you are left with remembrance that is fragmentary, provisional, curated by forces that have neither intention nor design. Each monument, each seal, Each battered dedicatory object tells one piece of a record, not the whole. And beneath the cycle of material endurance and archival gap, beneath the muttered correspondence and the silences in between, a more fundamental uncertainty persists. Which pieces of a record does permanence choose to keep? There is a comfort in the accepted view, the certainty that lexical lists, simple and spare, are scaffolds for language, set apart from the slow sediment of history. It is assumed, almost without scrutiny, that these lists are no more than the formal armature of instruction, that they do not venture beyond the classroom's chalk-dusted edge. The hand that writes, the pupil that recites together, they are thought to conjure only the nuts and bolts of utterance, detached from the flow of particular events or the memory of specific names. The exercise begins and ends, so it is believed, within four walls, lexicon as tool, lexicon as neutral ground. Yet pause with the lists themselves, and silence alters its texture. The tablets and fragments persist, holding more than their assumed function. In quiet, under the eye, or in the soft shadow of the reading room, something unsettles the neat boundary. Amongst ordered columns of terms, these instructional recitations, there emerge names, not just words, but proper names, titles that once referred to someone, somewhere, administrative markers, technical designations, names resonant with a particular belonging. These reside side by side with the words for God, element, thing. The lexical lists refuse to remain unanchored. They gather within themselves traces both common and singular. The synonym list becomes not just a record of language, but of presence. The archival corpus is not silent. It bears its contradictions patiently. In one instance, a comparison unfolds. The lexical lists and the King List, side by side, in imagination, in methodology, in documented fragments that have outlasted the hand and voice that made them. The King List is a lineage, unbroken or halting, asserting continuity in the face of decay. The lexical list, by contrast, is a loose gathering, yet names drift between them. Names appear not only in the register of sovereigns, but as exemplars. The lists carry their own marginalia, their echoes of power, administration, and identity. In the scribe's exercise, a name becomes a rubric, a cipher, a lesson. The instructional overlaps with the historical. Precision blurs into utility. You stand before a tablet, worn but intact. A notice, an entry among animal names. A kingly title, recorded, overwritten. Then, corrected. An administrative term, preserved in the same column as compounds for harvest and barrier. The patterns repeat, but always with difference. No two lists are alike. The text does not explain, does not justify selection. Some names remain familiar, others are irretrievably lost. The act of copying, silent and slow, admits nothing. Each variant is a trace of context never recorded, of an instructor's preference. The archive grows heavier, the margins expanding with every unspoken rationale. Didactic intent, it seems, folds into preservation. The exercise is also a record, every selection a kind of curation. To teach is to hold on to something, to select what is worthy of repetition. So the pedagogical archive shadows the historical archive, intersecting in ways that neither intend nor dissolve. Names that do not make their way into royal chronicles persist in the repetition of drill. The exercise becomes the carrier, the list an unlikely arc for minor histories. One does not know if the lists mean to capture. The evidence does not indicate what is deliberate and what is arbitrary, nor is there certainty about what meanings were imparted, which absences were felt. You look again at the lines upon lines, clipped, repetitive, yet with glimmers of specificity. The juxtaposition is itself a record, unplanned perhaps, but no less decisive for that. The scribe, in making the ordinary exercise, pulls names into continuity, even as the lines become indistinct over time. The teacher, with no audience left, defers to the archive. Strata accumulate. Dust settles. Instruction is not only renewal, but sedimentation, a layering of use, loss, return. The lists circle back on themselves. In the present, the fragments sit, silent in curated drawers or the half-light of digital repositories. They do not answer the questions they evoke. The work of comparison leads only to the evidence that remains visible, that which was deemed worth repeating, or was merely available to be repeated. The boundaries between instruction and preservation are indistinct, drawn only by the form and frequency of surviving scripts. Reading. One does not know whether to see a technical vocabulary or a ledger of overlooked presence. The archive's surface is smooth, but below, patterns tangle and erase themselves. What is gathered for practice ultimately changes what is remembered incrementally, by omission as much as by inclusion. Not to document. The evidence resists its own reduction. It is inseparable from its silences. Here in the margin, language and history negotiate, not fully meeting, not fully parting. At the threshold where lesson and legacy converge, one is left to wonder. How much of history is carried in the margins of a classroom exercise? It is said so often, so quietly, as to invite no contradiction that the persistence of a city is a feat of politics alone. That span and lineage depend upon the choices of rulers, scribes, gatekeepers, that a city is anchored not by sediment or current, but by decree and record, will and chart. The list extends itself across centuries, capturing each settlement as if by fixing it eternally in place. Each name, a pin precisely thrust into the map. Each port, a dot, unwavering by the edge of a remembered water. The memory of the city is thus maintained by the faith that place and name are bound together, unyielding to erosion or passage. It is a belief that sits deep in the stories told. To possess a name is to persist. To persist is to remain unmoved. Under this belief, the ground beneath each city is presumed steady, passive, silent, a mere stage for the human tale. Rivers move. Their channels uncoil and drift with a memory all their own. Across the centuries, avulsions cleave old waters from new beds, dividing what once seemed indivisible, shifting silt and meaning alike. The passage of the river is not a matter of decree, not a question of intent. It is neither silent nor entirely legible, but it leaves traces for those who look. The surface of the plain appears calm enough, and yet beneath it, stories written not in clay or stone, but in the patterns of alluvium. These do not announce themselves. They wait to be discovered, to be inscribed in another kind of record. The surveyor walks a slow, wide arc across what modern ground permits. Instruments lowered, lines cast, each measurement accumulating into mapping. The survey maps, archived, tracing not the cities themselves but their absences. Where today the rivers curve, data reveals older turns, banks long since starved of flow, silted through, channels severed from their sources, ghosted into the pattern of the plain, set against occupation layers uncovered by cautious excavation. Ports that find mention in text no longer align themselves beside water, marooned on paleochannels, stranding the logic of old routes. You stand or kneel where a map or a tablet names a city's quay, and find only dust, reed ghosts, compacted silt refusing explanation. Accounted, memorialized as if location were neutral, as if earth and flow had no part in the story. The list presents its cities with fixed confidence. Name follows on from name, as though each proceeds from a singular, undisturbed coordinate. Beneath the surface, however, destabilization, records of relocation, redirection, abandonment, and resettling. Not in decree, but in the gentle rise of ground, the oblique angle of refuse, the deviation of strata. Names remain where ground does not. Occupations cluster and fade, forced by the terrain's pulse rather than by any intention. The first evidence is subtle, a deviation in the expected level. A layer of silt overlaying habitations, shells pressed into unlikely places. Later, more abrupt, the occupational surface simply missing from where the list demands it. the tell truncated by scouring or buried entire beneath the sudden heaviness of the river's turn. Physical dislocation accumulates as punctuation, breaking what appears seamless to the eye or to the archive. The very terrain imposes its own rhythm upon human memory. Silence interrupted, memory scattered, continuity fractured by the undirected will of water and ground. Records stretch to accommodate this instability, but are always slightly behind, naming what is already gone, plotting coordinates for absences, mapping silence where there was once commotion. There is a strange fidelity in these records, a form of memory composed not only from what endures, but from the withdrawal of certainty itself. Where one expects the ground to yield up a settled story, there is instead a palimpsest of displacement, a city that is both here and not here, named yet untethered, bearing the residue of former courses and prior logics of habitation. The surveyors measure, they inscribe, and still cannot fix place beyond the reach of this geomorphic restlessness. What is left is interval and drift, patterns of abandonment replayed in successive epochs, the persistent mismatch between the lists of names and the evidence of ground. The notion of city, when shadowed by such movement, becomes less an address than an echo, less a pin on a chart than a pause in terrain. One stands over dust that holds a name, yet the ground quietly insists on another history. The archives, the survey maps, the channels etched on the landscape together suggest not certainty, but the slow and persistent undoing of place. Each avulsion registered not only in the landscape but in memory's fractured record, an ongoing negotiation, silent, unresolved, marked by what can be seen but not quite stated. The question presses from beneath. Where the ground has moved beneath a name, what does that name hold? It is often quietly assumed, passed from hand to hand, that the flow of names on a royal list establishes not only the cadence of rulership, but also the slow, continual pulse of the living, the shaping of social fabric, the heartbeat of a population, the momentum of a city, all presumed to echo the deliberate succession documented in palace records. Reeds pressed into clay, stone etched with order, the sense lingers. Where the royal line holds unbroken, the world within its boundaries must be continuous as well. Still, beneath this symmetry, silence begins to gather. To accept the lists as mirrors of life is to overlook the quiet labour of the dead, those whose presence registers less as declaration than as sediment, slowly accumulating. One must descend, both literally and conceptually, to the margins of cities, a careful movement through the layered dust of cemeteries. Here, in the registry of interments and the inventory of bones, the myth of seamless continuity draws breathless. Cemetery registers, some no more than faint ink on brittle sheets, others present only as tabulated memory, drift through the hands of record keepers. Each entry once marked a cessation of breath, a relocation from the tumult of the living to the stillness of earth. Burial assemblages, touched by many unseen hands, display not perpetuity but variation, objects nestled close to bone in one generation, absent in the next. Osteological counts performed in the fading light of late afternoon, layer by layer, present the arithmetic of mortality in a language different from that of royal accountancy. But they do not sing the song of the lists. Instead, they flicker. A sudden shift in mortality curve here, the concentration of a certain age elsewhere, the echo of calamity unstated, the quieting of a line. In the stratigraphy of grave goods, silence abounds. Objects that should have accompanied the departed, by the dictates of previous custom, are sometimes missing, sometimes replaced, sometimes returned after a long absence. The changing lexicon of burial practice, body position, orientation, the spacing of the dead, becomes a ledger in itself, a ledger not always aligning with the steady progression of names. In the calculus of bones and things left behind, continuity proves more elusive than the neat columns of sovereign succession. At edges where cemetery soil meets the archaeological shadow of political power, where gravestones brush against the sunken remnants of a ruler's wall, another pattern emerges, as if the dead and the named exist beside one another, but out of phase. Layers associated with a certain ruler's name yield burials of unconventional form, or none at all. Distribution changes. The density thins or pools. Space is reordered underfoot. The mark of political shift appears as an absence or distortion in the mortuary map rather than as a simple replacement. No file or field yields evidence for uninterrupted dynastic tenure within a single household. Spread across the social expanse for the measured decades or centuries, the list implies. Instead, what remains is motion families forming, dispersing, dissolving, social units reconstituting across generations, locations quietly abandoned and then quietly repopulated. The ground registers too many departures for certainty. If there was ever settlement without interruption, it is not confirmed in bone or soil, not made manifest in the order of graves. The written list stretches, artificially smooth, across an uneven terrain of the forgotten. So, the dead offer a different record. Not one of descent, but of movement, interruption, adaptation. Every bone catalogued, every pottery shard mapped, every empty grave site speaks not only to presence but to disappearance. Beneath the enumeration of kings, there drifts the unquiet numerical logic of demography. Fastenings made and unfastened. Names spoken briefly, then lost. The registry of the dead is a motion blurred, where the list is a pedigree unbroken. To walk through these layers is to listen for what is absent as much as what remains. There is no simple reading, no final concordance between the list upheld in the palace and the quiet record kept by earth and silence. Each method of recording carries its own silence, leaves its own omissions. What does it mean for the story of collective life if the most enduring record is not the proclamation of rule, but the pattern of burial, the intervals and disjunctions, the succession of absences and returns? What does a roster of rulers finally mean? Set beside the record of those who were simply buried and forgotten, the accepted assumption persists. The sky is a ledger, steady and unyielding, granting to human history its anchor stones. We are taught to believe that the stars, the measured wanderings of planets, the thick silence of the lunar shadows swallowed by the earth, offer fixed points against which the drifting narrative of dynasties can be moored. Astronomical observations, it is said, lend weight and clarity to the inevitably eroded chronologies left by rule and ritual. The record begins not with the loud arrival of certainty, but in the condensation of darkness, in the careful watching of horizons. Each night, observers anonymous now, names eroded to dust, sat beneath the unaging sky, noting the slow pace of Mars, the sudden blindness following the moon's retreat, the rare conversations between planets and unfamiliar stars. They did not see themselves as creators of certainty. They recorded, and that was enough. Eclipses, risings, omens. Each event pressed into lists, ordered, but never rooted in the rock of named reigns. What remains are the omen series, enigmatic and spare. They do not announce, in the reign of this king, such and such occurred. Instead, sequences unfold: a red disk swallowed in the east, a double star flaring in an unexpected season, Venus appearing where it should not. These signs are not stories. They are not continuous. They do not care for the neat succession of monarchs. They accumulate in silence, tied only to their own internal rhythm, separated from the rises and falls of thrones. Each omen text forms a register of evidence, precise in its notation. There are dates, intervals, phenomena remarked with an eye unclouded by purpose. But the gap makes itself felt. There are no bridges drawn by the hand that saw the sky and the hand that named the rain. The King List runs parallel, indifferent, its own chronology of ascension and succession, rarely pausing to nod toward the uncertain drama above. The archival voices speak past one another, each whole and fragmented in their isolation. Efforts arise to align the night's memory with the daylight's governance, to mark where an omen sequence might echo the rule of a distant king. Correlations are built with care but rest on the narrow planks of interpretation. Where the sky mentions a sign, the list of rulers offers a name. but the two do not grasp hands across the archive's gulf. There is no notation in the sky's own record to confirm the rain beneath it. There are only the interpretive bridges, airy structures built by later minds, not by the witnesses themselves. The evidence resists full union. Astral records are unwavering in their own measure, dates, intervals, repetition, unconcerned with authority or lineage. The lists of kings are equally unyielding, structured by the ordered succession of power, names stacked one upon another with a confidence the sky never claims. When attempts at translation between these records falter, it is not abrupt but subtle, a failure to meet in the dusk between certainty and suggestion. The compilation of eclipses is complete to its own task, but its silence rings louder in the gap where a king should be named. The omen series persist, their notations preserved on clay, yet the names they lack grow only heavier with time. Dust fills the corridors between these archives, echoing with the effort to align registers whose very nature is to remain apart. What does it mean when the chronicle of the sky and the chronicle of the throne refuse to acknowledge one another? Which archive deserves preeminence when their translation across registers fails a celestial catalogue untouched by dynastic ambition, or a succession of rulers unilluminated by the firmament's measure? You trace your finger along the edge of a fractured tablet, numbers carved by a careful hand lost to centuries. You measure the intervals, the faded cuneiform marks delineating passages. You note, with a kind of reverence, the deliberate silence that follows each remark, the refusal to name, the reluctance to bind sky to throne. Memory shifts and reforms, but the gap, the pause, remains. There is a hush embedded within the dust of these archives. It is not the hush of ignorance or neglect, but of two kinds of certainty, each closed, each partial, each unwilling to surrender its evidence to the other. The succession of rulers is complete for theirs. In between, the witness now vanished allowed the chasm to persist. No effort is made to force unity. There is a refusal in the record, the quiet assertion that some boundaries are not for crossing. It is a presence, a reminder that what remains is not defective, but emblematic of having endured rupture after rupture. In each omission, there is an accumulation of meaning, a suggestion that not every uncertainty is meant to be resolved by the patchwork logic of correlation. What echoes by omission is often more telling than what survives in confident connection. Each time the archives are revisited, the cycle repeats. Observation, notation, omission, attempted translation, failure or uneasy imprecision. The registers do not draw closer. They round one another, cautious, unmelded. You are left to choose which notation is to be trusted, knowing both are whole and incomplete, luminous and shadowed. And when the last record-keeper's hand withdraws from the tablet, when the sky and the throne close again into their separate silences, which archive remains when the act of translation itself is lost? It begins, as so many inquiries do, with an enduring confidence. Somewhere between stone and script, there rests a premise so deeply rooted that it barely registers as conviction but serves nevertheless as the floor beneath all method. That the passage of lives, reigns, and events finds its clear account in the convergence of textual record and buried material. That, if patience and care enough, houses excavated from layers of time, silent temple deposits, and the detritus of industry pottery abraded by use, shards of ceilings, and tools outlasted by their purposes will, when read beside king lists and ancient names, yield a single continuous history. The assumption lies quietly under each measured trench, each digitized inventory, that somewhere, eventually, the line of the list and the layers of the soil will meet, that the past, however silent, is composed of sequences that only need recovering, fitting, aligning. This expectation recurs, gently unexamined, in notes set down at the dig's edge and in more formal ledgers, in the rhythms of sorting, labeling, matching eras to names. But the soil records its reluctance. In the strata, the evidence waits, not with the smoothness of script, but unsettled. The list passes from ruler to ruler, each reign given a span, sometimes 100 years, sometimes more. As the script unfurls, the stone persists, fragmentary yet insistent. Excavated houses open up spaces layered with overlapping vessels, sherds incised and burnished, handled and discarded in cycles beyond remembering, pressed together by the weight of time. Temple deposits unfold as silent stutters in the earth, places where intention and accident gather together and entangle, leaving behind offerings altered by generations. Industrial quarters offer up tools worn by many hands and ceilings reused, broken, and amalgamated until their origins vanish, even to the careful observer. The assemblages rise, drift, diminish. Clay is replaced. Forms migrate. Styles move from hand to hand. Relics of use and discard, traces of someone's ordinary gesture, gather in layers that resist being compressed into the reign of one, or the memory of a single name. Observing the evidence, you step quietly in the cool, shifted dust, tracing the outlines of domicile after domicile. Pottery signals darker and lighter periods, a language of shapes and slips and faint residue. Each sequence, the hesitant joining of one vessel formed to another, the succession of mortared wall to collapsed corner, draws out the passing of years, not as a singular stride, but a continuum composed of arrival and disappearance. See how the layers fold together. A simple jar echoes a previous form, then breaks from it. In a different house, a style revives, but the clay is now unfamiliar, the slip darker, a signalling of movement across some unspoken distance. Working hands have come and gone. Each sherd, classified and catalogued, tells not of a dynasty, but of recurrent threshold, replacement, slow forgetting. Temple deposits, catalogued by depth and sequence, inflect the story not towards stability but disruption. Here, an older vessel is deposited anew, centuries after it was formed. Inscriptions elsewhere name rulers whose span is claimed to run for many lifetimes, yet the deposit tells nothing of them directly. The fragments assemble without clarity. Objects gathered with intent intermingle with accidental collapse. In the ledgers, the records extend both downwards into deeper earth and sideways into uncertainty. Which offering belongs to whose era? Which act is an echo, which is a beginning? The archive does not offer a simple contour. It frames only the recurrence of effort, the depth of loss, and traces fragile circles of meaning. Industrial quarters layer over each other, in the margins of settlement, in places of labour and discard. The evidence, as observed without interpretation, is patient but unyielding. Tools are replaced not by punctuated innovation, but by the quiet inexorability of need and absence. Ceilings, once marked by stamp or hand, bear the erasures of reuse. Names on tablets offer a chronology of offices and reigns, but the physical seals record occlusion, substitution, invisible negotiations. Registries note each find the weight of a handle, the colour of a slip, the shattering of a kiln in fire or abandonment. Names and material rarely clasp. They circle one another with only brief correspondences. Even when pottery in a layer seems to coincide with a claimed regnal span, comparative inquiry undermines the fit. Adjacent sites show divergence, replacement, rhythm, out of step. The past does not resolve into a single story. Instead, your attempts to synchronize the list with the churn of the physical world are met with obstacles of form, style, tempo, turnover, and replacement echo constantly. Assemblages trace not the biography of a monarch, but the slow and repetitive movement of communities, the dialogue of regions, the silent repetition of useful shapes. The list's spans, massive and seemingly absolute, cannot compress the complicated interleaving of things. Material relics signal a world of ongoing change, a world that cannot be simply charted by rain or event. Absence interrupts certainty. What remains unaligned is as crucial as what can be brought near. Is it failure, this inability to compress everything to a neat, linear convergence? The temptation to seek method in the discord is strong, but the archive, split across registers, text and stone, script and sherd, insists on parallel existence. Fragments persist in their own shapes, records seduce with their own logics, names drift without anchors in the ground. The disjunction is not a flaw in method, but emerges as a structural quality of the evidence itself. To observe carefully is to hold both the convergence and the deviance, to admit the discontinuity as a condition rather than a problem. The observer records, pauses, records again, understanding growing only at the limits of compression. Memory and loss become indistinguishable in the faded boundary between what can be put in sequence and what dissolves into mixture. The archives endure, side by side, untwined. What does it mean to dwell among records that will not be made one? You began with clay and silence. You end with clay and inheritance. The marks you have followed are not merely relics but responsibilities. Evidence remains in fragments, in layers, in discontinuities you may keep and tend. We are caretakers of records we do not fully translate. Will you return to the dust with attention rather than answer, with patience rather than closure? If you remain, like, subscribe, and keep the slow work of listening alive.